Well, this is February the 19th, 2025. I can't believe we're already into 2025. And we're in the Russell Library on the University of Georgia campus in Athens, Georgia. My name is Margaret Holt. I'm a retired faculty member from the Department of Adult Education at the University of Georgia. I retired in 2000, so I've been very fortunate to enjoy a number of years of retirement, and I am here with my good friend and a longtime usual suspect, Gordhan Patel, Dr. Gordhan Patel. Those of you who are familiar with the University of Georgia and Athens, Georgia, probably know Gordhan Patel, or at least you've heard of him. He had a very illustrious career at the University of Georgia and was a microbiologist, at one time head of the zoology department. Later, when I really got to know him a little better, he was the dean of the graduate school. And following that, he had, at the end of his career, his stint as the vice president for research at the University of Georgia. So those are all his really amazing academic credentials, but we are really here today to talk about some of the things in his more personal life, his family life. And so therefore, I'm going to ask Gordhan, before I start with some of our questions, if there's anything else that he might like to say about himself before I jump into these questions. And thanks for doing this interview.
Well, thank you, Margaret. As you said, we've been friends for
almost 50 years.
Almost 50 years, and colleagues at the University of Georgia. As Margaret said, I was at the university. I spent 38 years at the university, from starting as an assistant professor in 1967. We had moved here from Buffalo, New York, and University of Georgia at that time was really known as a party school. But so as I say, I was at Buffalo, New York, the State University of New York, where my wife and I had come as postdocs. Both of us met in graduate school and at Washington University in St. Louis, and ended up in Buffalo. And when I was looking for a faculty position, one of the places that I had decided to go to was University of Chicago, and they had offered me an assistant professorship. And then out of the blue, I get a call from Georgia asking me to come down for an interview. As a background, University of Georgia was really a Southern school, not in the research arena, a player. And my first reaction was, Georgia? Versus I'm weighing Georgia versus University of Chicago Medical School. But fortunately, our mentor, Dr. Wong, he was very influential in our life. He had been my research advisor at Washington University. And he said to me, first, they had the courtesy to invite you, so I think you should go. And second, the most important advice he gave me, he said, never turn down a job before it's offered to you.
Wonderful.
So I flew down to Athens, Georgia, left Buffalo, New York with 30 feet of snowdrifts at the airport. As you probably know, in Buffalo, the wind blows through those buildings like a tunnel at 70 miles an hour sometimes. And I landed in Buffalo, in Georgia, with beautiful 65-degree sunny weather, a winter jasmine blooming, camellias blooming. So I'll tell you later, but I was born and raised in Mozambique, so which is southern part of Mozambique, which was more like Florida.
So I want to stop you there, Gordon, and say to you, your last name is Patel. Now, I think I've heard recently that there are more people at the University of Georgia who have the last name Patel than the last name Smith. But when you say Mozambique, I wouldn't have thought Mozambique. I would have thought you would have said India. How did you end up in Mozambique?
Well, that is my family story. A lot of people don't realize that East Africa and India had trade relations for centuries. And most Indians would end up going to the British colonies, like Kenya, Uganda, Tanganyika. And my family in India came from a small agricultural village. They were farmers, basically. And I'm talking about a small village that had maybe about 100, 150 homes. And in the beginnings of 1900s, my grandfather was the first person of the village who had gone to Africa, and was in Cape Town. I guess he had some kind of a business. I know unfortunately, very little about it. So in late 20s, 1930s, my father and his brothers decided also to go join up with their father in Cape Town. Mm-hmm. And the story I heard was when the ship stopped in Mozambique, the southern tip of Mozambique, where the capital was. And in the days then, it was called Lorenzo Marcus. My father and his brothers heard that South Africa was not allowing any more Indian immigrants. So that's how they ended up getting off the ship in a Portuguese colony that had been there since Vasco da Gama in early 1500s had established a colony there. And that is how they ended up in Mozambique.
So what was your life like there?
Oh my gosh. As I said, my father and his brothers went there in late 1920s, 1930s. And then my mother and my aunts joined them. And one of my regrets is I did not ask my father, how did they manage in a country that spoke Portuguese, which was not something they were anywhere near familiar with? How did they get the money to get started? What was life like there? But they did end up buying a banana plantation. And as I told you earlier, in India, they were farmers, they're peasants. And they were, I guess, reasonably successful because they were shipping bananas to South Africa, to Rhodesia. And then, as happens in a lot of Indian families, my aunt would write to my father saying, she has a son who needs a job. So he would come, and my father would create some part of the, for example, between the banana rows, they would grow vegetables. And then another nephew needed a job, so they would go into importing fruit from South Africa, like grapes and peaches, which did not grow in Mozambique. And then these young men would come of marriageable age and go to India and get married and bring their bride. So when I was growing up in the 40s, my father's household consisted of 3 houses, the Patel compound, about 20, 25 members of my family doing different kind of family-owned operations, which, as I say, started with banana plantations, then growing vegetables, and then importing fruit from South Africa, then having outlets in the city for these materials.
So you spoke Portuguese?
Yes, I spoke Portuguese. I grew up speaking Portuguese, and of course the Indian language, the Gujarati,
Okay.
which is one of the languages in India. And I should point out that India has 20 plus individual independent languages. So
Amazing. Just amazing.
India is like Europe.
Yes.
A lot of people don't think about India as being like Europe, but it is. In fact, there are two different linguistic groups. So I spoke Gujarati, which is the language spoken on the west coast of India. Okay.
So you ended up somehow in the United States. Here you were in Mozambique, you were speaking Portuguese, your extended family is operating this banana and other things plantation, and you end up in the United States. How did you get to the United States? Or why did you come to the United States?
Well, as I tell people, one question always, for me, begs another question. Okay? And in fact, I'm writing right now, at the urging of my grandchildren and my friends, the history of my family. Okay? But as I was saying that, where was I?
Well, I'm trying to get you to the United States.
I know. But before I come to,
Okay.
again, the politics got in my way. Okay? When I was growing up in Mozambique, my father, and he had a very good friend who was a missionary doctor from Switzerland, and they had already planned my entire educational career. Because I was in the Portuguese system, but the Indian community in Lourenço Marques, which is now called Maputo, by the way, after independence of Mozambique, had a school that they had established there for the Indian children to learn the language and a few things like that. But we also had to go, it was compulsory for us to go to the Portuguese schools. So again, as I was saying, my father, and at that time there were no universities in Mozambique. So
so you weren't going to go to the university because there weren't any?
There weren't any. So as far as I could have gone was to finish lycée, which is equivalent to advanced high school. And then most people would go to Europe to go to medical school or engineering or whatever advanced degree they wanted. So that's what my father had planned for me. Now, one of the people in my family compound was my aunt's brother. So he was really treated as my maternal uncle in the Indian system. And he had been involved with Gandhi's independence movement from the British in India. And in 1947, when the British left and India became independent, this uncle in India needed a job. So he, again, comes to Mozambique, and he's a teacher in the Indian school system there.
Okay.
And he kept brainwashing me. He kept saying, you don't need to go to Europe. You need to go to India, and you learn about your culture. And being 14, 15-year-old, I was very impressionable. And of course, the Indians were also very proud of the fact that the British had left and India had become independent. So I told my dad that I want to go to India. And my dad said, you don't want to go to Portugal or Switzerland? I said, no, I want to go to India. So He said, okay, you want to go to India, you go to India. So this uncle of mine, who had friends in India who were involved in starting school, they were all educators. And so my uncle arranged for me to go to one of the schools in India, a boarding school in India, where all the educational system was transpired in the Gujarati language, which
Okay.
is language of the state,
Which you already spoke.
which I already spoke.
Yeah.
Yes. And the boarding school that I went to was about 120 miles from my village where my family was originally. So when I went to India, I went to my uncle, my father's older brother, was taking care of the family affairs there, and so he picked me up from the port in Bombay. It's called Mumbai now, and took me to this boarding school, and I arrived there with my typical colonial garb, silk shirts and poplin pants, and the school was started by some of the friends of my uncle, who were followers of Gandhi, meant simplicity, wearing clothes made out of homespun material, which was rough. And the director of the boarding school told my uncle to take all my silk shirts and poplin pants back to the village and take me into the town and buy me some shorts and shirts and a metal plate for my food. And so it was very exciting, right? I mean, because I grew up in Mozambique more in the European style of living. But after about 2 or 3 months of getting up at 5, cold showers, I began to say, what the hell am I doing here?
Take me back to Mozambique. Yeah.
But I was too proud to write home to say I want to come home. So I stuck it out for 4 years, high school in India.
And then?
And then time to choose a college. So I chose to go to Bombay. Again, it's called Mumbai now. I was accepted. I was a very good student, so I was accepted at all the top colleges in Mumbai. So I picked one, Wilson College. Wilson College was a Methodist college, which was located right on the beach in Mumbai. I could actually see the ocean from my
Nice.
dormitory room.
Yeah.
And it was interesting that I had just barely learned to speak English in the high school. And then I end up in Wilson College, where everything is in English.
Okay, so this is the transition now
This
to...
was a major transition for me. Fortunately, I was endowed with good memory, so I could just sit there and listen and not worry about listening and taking notes. And then I would depend on textbooks. Anyway, so at the end of my first year of college, I felt, okay, it's been 5 years since I've seen my family in Mozambique, my parents in Mozambique. Of course, I had the family in the village that I visited on holidays and all, summertime and whatnot. So I wrote to my dad, said, I would like to come visit. So he said, okay, it's been 5 years. So he sent me an airline ticket. I flew to Mozambique in the summer of in the spring of 1956, fully intending to go back to continue my college in Mumbai, in India. So I'm going to have to interject a little political history here. Portugal had, a lot of people don't realize, but Portugal, one of the first European countries to start exploring the Atlantic Ocean and the west coast of Africa. And they started putting down their markers. So they had, in the early 1500s, they had colonies in Cape Verde, in Angola, Guinea-Bissau, and you remember from your history books that Vasco da Gama was the person who circumvented the tip of Africa, and that's how they established a colony in Mozambique. And Vasco da Gama found the maritime route to India, where in early 1500, they established a small colony called Goa. Again, a little bit of history. Prior to this, in Europe, all the spices from India were brought by the Arabs on camelbacks. And Venice and Genoa in Italy,
Yes.
those were the major ports of spice trading. Again, these are the spices that came on camelbacks. Certainly, Vasco da Gama started bringing spices from India, shiploads full. And Lisbon, that was at one time the backwaters of Europe, became the major spice trading center. So Portugal became a very wealthy country in the 1500s. And there's a long history about how Spain took over again and whatnot. But again, as I said, the Portuguese had established colony in India, Goa. 1947, the British left. The French used to have a small colony on the east coast of India called Pondicherry. The French left, but the Portuguese would not give up Goa. So Indian government tried through the United Nations and other venues to pressure Portugal into leaving. But so when I was in Mozambique, Portugal and India were having serious political differences over Goa. Again, if you remember, I was born in Mozambique, so I was a Portuguese citizen and carried a Portuguese passport. So the Portuguese government would not allow me to go back to India to continue my college. Okay. So by that time, I was out of the Portuguese educational system, and the Indians followed the English system. So my choices were going to England or Britain or coming to the United States. Again, when I was in a boarding school in India, one of my teacher's friends was an engineering student, and he had come to Georgia Tech.
Really? Incredible.
For his master's degree. So he wrote to me saying, forget about going to Britain, come to the United States. So he sent me application forms from all the major universities in the United States. And by the time I was getting ready to come, he had finished his master's degree in Georgia Tech in Atlanta, and his first job was in St. Louis. So he had also sent me application materials from Washington University.
And you'd never thought about this before, right?
No,
right.
no. Coming to America was the farthest thing in my mind. And so I applied to a variety of schools, and I got accepted everywhere, except I was not accepted at Washington University.
You were not?
I did not hear from them. Okay. And of course, everybody knows about New York, and everybody knows about Columbia University. And so I had used my admission. What you need is something called the I-20 form that the universities would issue to an international student. Then you go with that form to the American embassy or consulate to get the student visa. So I got a visa to come to the United States, to come to Columbia University. And when I landed in New York, it was about 2 weeks before the classes were to start. So I called up my friend in St. Louis. Well, it turned out that he had married before coming to the United States, but his bride was still in India. So when he moved to St. Louis, his bride came to St. Louis. Okay. So I called him from New York Airport, and he said, well, you have some time, why don't you come to Athens?
St. Louis.
To St. Louis. So I flew to St. Louis, and he asked me what happened to Washington University. And I told him I never heard from them.
Wow.
Well, he happened to be living only about a few blocks from Forest Park, which is a beautiful park in the middle of the city. And one of the borders of Forest Park is Lindell Boulevard that had big mansions. And at the end of Lindell Boulevard sat Washington University on the hilltop. Looked like a proper university. And so he said, well, why don't you go and find out what's going on? So I went to the dean's office and wanted to know what had happened to my application. Mm-hmm. So I remember his name. It was Dean Jensen. He was the dean of admissions. He had his secretary bring my file to him, and he looked at the file, and he looked at me, and he looked at the file, and he looked at me, and he finally says, Mr. Patel, how did you get visa to come to the United States? I said, I got a visa because I got an I-20 form from Columbia University. And he said, Columbia University in New York? I said, yeah, is there another Columbia University? So by that time, I said, is that a problem? And he looks at me and says, Mr. Patel, we did not accept you because all these D's on your record, academic record.
Meaning to him that you hadn't done well.
I hadn't done well. Well, what had happened was, this is before the Xerox machine, so the photostat copy
Right.
of my transcripts that went to Washington University, the bottom explanation of the symbols was not there. So I showed him my original certificate, which described the D's meant distinction. That was the highest grade you could get.
Yeah, that's a little different from here, isn't it?
So then Jensen says to me, well, said, no wonder you're going to Columbia University, but you know, New York is a terrible place for an international student. I think you should stay in Athens, I mean in St. Louis.
Yes.
So I went and talked to my friend, and again, going back to my background, I was a total vegetarian growing up in a Gujarati household.
Of course.
I did not even have eggs before coming to the United States. And my friend said, why don't you stay and share this apartment with us?
Wonderful.
And of course, by that time, his wife had joined the group. So I would be having home-cooked, proper Indian
food.
So that's how I ended up at Washington University.
Yeah, and then something happened there very significant in your life, and that you met a woman who you later married. You want to tell us about that?
Of course, okay. Because, so as I said, I got to Washington University in 1956, And I was a pre-med. I had gone there to go, ostensibly go to medical school, and then go back to Mozambique and be a doctor. That was the original plan. But Washington University was a small school, but had at least 2 or 3 or 4 faculty members who were Nobel laureates. Arthur Compton, who was a physicist who had been involved with the Los Alamos project during the Second War, he had come back after the war to Washington University, and he had brought with him some very high-ranking chemists and physicists. The medical school at Washington University already had two professors, or 3, who were Nobel laureates. One of them was Karl Corey, who was Austrian, and his wife Gertie Corey. So the 2 of them had shared a Nobel Prize. And I understand that Gertie Corey was only the 2nd woman who ever got a Nobel Prize.
Wow.
Okay. So, and then in the Department of Zoology, where I was an undergraduate major, at that time there were only departments of zoology and botany. And the head of zoology was Victor Homburger, again, a world-famous embryologist. And they would invite all their friends who were Nobel laureates or the members of the National Academy. And I was just this kid from Africa, and I was exposed to these giants of research. And I took a course in embryology, and that's where I first met Jinx, who is now my wife of 60 years. And so I wrote to my dad, and I should say my undergraduate advisor, Dr. Carson, used to look at me and said, "Gordon, you want to be a doctor." He had that sneer about, you want to go look at people's ears and nose and throat. And I was impressionable. I was, meeting all the Nobel laureates. So I wrote to my dad. I said, "Dad, I know you sent me here to go to medical school, but I really want to be a scientist." So this is 1959 when I had to make the decision. So he said, "Do whatever you want to do." So I went and talked to Dr. Hamburger, and I said, "What do I have to do to go to graduate school?" And he said, "Oh, just talk to my secretary." And I did not have to take GREs because I had taken MCATs to go to medical school.
Right.
So he said, "That's good enough." And to remind you, zoology was a very small, Washington University
Right.
had only about 45, less than 5,000 students. That included medical school and engineering, architecture, arts and sciences,
So
and had these high-powered professors.
did you meet Jinx in a class? Was she a student in some of your classes?
Yeah, so
Okay.
we were, she, by the way, I should say, had finished her undergraduate degree at Randolph-Macon Women's College in Lynchburg, Virginia. Now it's called Randolph College. It's a co-ed. But when she went to school there, it was a girls' school, a well-known girls' school. And she had come to Washington University because she was interested in embryology. And so in my senior year, I was taking this course called Developmental Endocrinology. And she was a typical Southern girl drinking Coca-Cola. And sitting in this classroom, she had come in, put down her Coke bottle, and then walked out to be socializing. and I was sitting, and I just could not resist taking her Coca-Cola and passing it down to students in the back. And Jinx walks in, and she said, looks at me and said, "You took my Coke." And I acted very innocent. I said, "Excuse me?"
Shame on you, Gordon.
Oh, she thought, "Oh my God, I have insulted this foreign student." So that's how we first interacted. And then we were taking this course, and then we took eventually the experimental embryology course from Dr. Hamburger, Victor Hamburger, where we were working in the laboratory late at night. And so we got to be friends during all this time. And of course, by that time I had girlfriends that I had in my undergraduate years. But Jinx and I became friends. And we so I enrolled into graduate school. And second year, Jinx and I took a course in biochemistry at the medical school. And that course was a tough course. It built character. So we would study together. And again, as I said, we were friends. She was dating other boys, and eventually we started dating. Okay.
Yeah.
So, and as I said, we've been married last November 60 years.
Well, that's why I want to move us, because I want to get to a part of this story where you and Jinx go to Mozambique. And something happens there.
Yes.
That's very significant, a very important marker event in your life. What was that?
Absolutely. So, 1963, my major professor was hired by the State University of New York because Nelson Rockefeller, who was the governor,
Right.
he had decided to model the New York universities after the California system. Mm-hmm. So he started establishing campuses called State University of New York, at Binghamton, at Buffalo.
In different places around the country.
And pouring money and hiring superstars. So my major professor got hired from Washington University, and I was in my last year. And I should say in 1961, my family had Indian Portugal finally came to at a confrontation. And I'm sorry for digressing.
No, that's okay.
But I have to.
Yeah.
There's a background to all of these questions.
Sure, absolutely.
Okay? So in 1961, Indians got tired of Portuguese leaving Goa. So one morning they militarily took over Goa, which was great for India because Goa had been a place where all the contraband and drug trafficking was happening. Unfortunately for my family in Mozambique, the only way the Portuguese could retaliate against India was to put all Indian citizens in a detention camp. Mm. It's like what the United States did to the Japanese.
Yes.
On the West Coast. And Portuguese government confiscated everything that my family owned. And as I said earlier, my family essentially was in banana plantations, and they had moved into real estate in the late 50s and early 60s.
And now they're in detention.
They're in detention, and they have lost ownership of their home, the cars, the land. The only thing that was salvaged was about 10%, which was my father had put in the name of the Portuguese citizens, because all these children born in Mozambique were Portuguese citizens. So that's what got salvaged. So Jinx and I get married in 1964, and Portugal, by that time, is really involved in all kinds of wars of independence from the African countries. Angola, Guinea-Bissau, Cape Verde Islands, Mozambique. There were movements of black Africans who wanted the countries back to them. Okay? So Portugal was heavily involved in guerrilla warfare from these independent African groups. The ones in Mozambique, they were called Frelimo, and they were supported because the United States supported Portugal, the Portuguese government. They had to go to China and Russia for financial help. So in 1974, Portuguese people were losing their children to these foreign wars. Portugal was not a rich country, so the war was costing them a lot of money. So a small group of the military forces there, they were leftists, so they took over the government. It only took 2 hours in April of 1974. And if you want to know the details, you can go to Wikipedia and type in Carnation Revolution.
Yes. It was called the Carnation Revolution.
That's right.
Yeah.
And because all the people were in favor of ending colonial wars and whatnot. So Portugal declared that this is April of 74, Portugal declared that they're going to end all wars and give Mozambique to Frelimo and other groups in Angola and Guinea-Bissau. So August of 1974,
Yeah.
but by that time, Jinx had not met my family because they were involved in all these political problems. So we thought it was time for me to take Jinx to Mozambique,
1974.
1974. And we arrived there, and I'm talking to my Portuguese friends, asked them what did they think about Frelimo taking over the country, and they all said, oh, no problem. You know, look at in Brazil, we all coexist, and we can do that here. And after all, only 3% of Mozambique's population is non-black. So I thought this was going to be a wonderful political transition from colonialism to independent African country. Unfortunately, a small, very wealthy Portuguese, white Portuguese families that had major financial interest in Mozambique and in Lorenzo Marques, they decided that they did not like this arrangement, Portugal giving Mozambique to Frelimo. So they staged a takeover of the radio station, train station, number of strategic places.
Right.
But first was the radio station, and they started broadcasting impassioned speeches about how we built this country. Portugal should give it to us. Now, they had a model in Rhodesia where Ian Smith, a few years earlier, had declared unilateral independence from Britain. So they kept saying on the radio how Ian Smith was sending them paratroopers. South Africa, this is before South Africa became, which was still apartheid and white rule.
So are you and Jinx in Mozambique at
We
this time?
We had arrived there, to visit my family.
Right.
And 3 days later, suddenly, we see the few families take over.
Right.
And next thing you knew, all the whites were out in the streets supporting this idea of Mozambique being taken over by white government, non-Portuguese, not colonial.
Right.
And again, as I say, as happens in crowd hysteria, some of the whites started going into black neighborhoods which surrounded the city and started shooting up some blacks. And they were demanding that Portugal discontinue the ongoing negotiations of transfer of power to Frelimo and instead talk to them. So we're suddenly in the middle of this very uneasy tension between blacks, resident blacks, and the whites. And I forget the exact time frame, but a couple of days later, suddenly there's this radio silence. And apparently what had happened was Portugal had sent an emissary and told these people who had taken over the radio station that Portugal was not giving in to their demands of the unilateral independence. And they had 24 hours blackout period to hightail to South Africa or to Rhodesia, wherever they wanted to go.
So were you and Jinx just kind of hiding out at your
we were
place?
at my family home.
Yes.
Not hiding out, but our home was on the outskirts suburbs of Lawrence and Marks. Okay? So we were just there, listening, glued to the radio to see what's going on. And the Portuguese emissary finally came on the radio and asked all these whites who had been camped out to go home, that they were not going to give in to the demands of these few white rich families. And they were going ahead with their plan to give the country to Frelimo. At which point, the black population that were on the outskirts of the city, lived on the outskirts, and would come into the city to work, they went on a rampage of looting and burning up shops and whatnot. And the Portuguese government did not know how to handle this. So they asked Frelimo to fly their commandos in. And Frelimo's operation was in Tanzania, the northern country of Mozambique. And the Frelimo soldiers came into Lorenzo Marques and managed to quell the violence that was being carried out and reopen the airport. But we were there for a few days when there was no food coming in because all the farms were on the other side of the black population. The airport was on the other side. And fortunately, my brother's in-laws had a supermarket. And they had a 5-story building. with a penthouse apartment.
So you could get food.
So we could get food, and by that time the violence had spread where my home was, so we all moved into the city and moved on to the 5th floor of this building that my brother's in-laws owned. And the Frelimo came in and reestablished order and opened the airport. During that time that we were there, it was clear that Frelimo was going to take over the country. They had already announced that there will be no private property, that they were going to nationalize all property. And whatever was remaining of my father's holdings, they were all real estate. So it was clear that my family is going to have to move out of Mozambique. So Jinx and I, by the way, I should say that when we went to Mozambique in 1974, our 2 daughters, Elizabeth was 6 years old and Krishna was 2 years old. So we had 2 and 6-year-old daughters with us in the middle of this revolution. So the American consulate, we went to the American consulate and we asked that my brother's 4 children be given visitors' visas because we wanted to get them out of Mozambique as soon as possible. So we're glad that the Portuguese, the American consulate gave my brother's 4 children visitors' visas.
So did they come home with you?
No, but we first got out of Mozambique with our 2 daughters and came back to Athens. And then a month or so later, 2 months later, my brother's 4 children arrived.
And where did they stay?
Well, the 4 children were aged 12 to 19. The oldest, 19, had 1 year of English. The rest of them only had Portuguese and some French. French was the second required language in Mozambique. So we suddenly went from a family of 4 to a family of 8.
Did they live with you?
Yes, overnight, of course. They moved in with us. And at that time, our house, we lived in Beechwood, that we had bought in 1968.
In Athens, Georgia?
In Athens, Georgia. Had 2 bathrooms and 3 bedrooms.
And 8 people.
And we had 8 people living there. And I should emphasize that except for the oldest daughter or niece, the rest of them spoke not a word of English. This is at Christmas time. They all arrived just before Christmas. And for them, of course, it was, a major transition in their life. Okay. No parents, totally foreign country for them. They did not speak the language. I should also say that, fortunately, in April of 1974, my sister and her family, who lived in Zambia, they had asked me to sponsor them to come to immigrate to the United States. So they had come to Athens, Georgia, in April of 1974. So it was my sister, her husband, and they had 3 children. So at least my nieces and nephews had my sister's family, where they could have vegetarian Indian cooking. And of course, so my family was essentially Jinx and I and our 2 daughters, our four nuclear family. 4 more nieces and nephews, 8, and my sister and her family of 5. So we were 13 Patels in Athens.
Yeah.
So having my sister here was a big help. But still, on a day-to-day basis, the four children, they had to transact dealing with Jinx, and Jinx had to deal with them. So we were in a big quandary as to what are we going to do with these four children.
Yeah. What are you going to do with them?
Exactly. So, of course, the long-range plan was we were going to sponsor my brother and my mother, whom I, as an American citizen, could sponsor to immigrate to the United States. So we, of course, got them, and very importantly, there was a 6-month transition period between Portugal and Frelimo taking over Mozambique.
So this is kind of the time you had to get them out of there?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, so that's the time that we were getting all the paperwork for their immigration through the American immigration system. But at Christmas time, we were trying to decide, what are we going to do with these children?
Yeah.
We consider briefly hiring a tutor for them to learn English.
Mm-hmm.
But eventually we thought, no, we're just going to put them in the public school systems.
In the Athens,
Athens,
Clark County public school system?
Clark County public school systems. So I should say, because we were caught up in this bloody mess in Mozambique, our story was all over the Athens newspaper. So everybody knew that we were caught up in this political quagmire in Mozambique. And of course, by that time, I was already promoted to associate professor. And Athens was, a small town. So Jinx and I were fairly well known among the Athens community.
And certainly the university community.
And the university community, yes. And so I should also add that my nieces and nephews had no academic records with them.
Right.
So we decided to take them to Clark Middle and Clark Central. And
three of them didn't speak English?
they did not speak a word of English. So Clark Middle, the youngest boy, Deepak, who was 12 years old, spoke no English, had no paperwork. We talked to the principal, and the principal found an American student who happened to be my department head's son.
Just a coincidence.
This was Peter Thompson's son, Philip. So my nephew Deepak said, okay, you are going to be following Philip wherever he goes, to the cafeteria, to the library, to the classes. So we got him settled at Clark Central. The oldest...
Did that work?
Well, let me just finish.
Okay.
The other two, Nalin and Madhu, we took them to high school, Clark Central. And Madhu was hooked up with Lindsay Payne. Lindsay Payne was a student there. And her father, Jack Payne, was, at that time, head of microbiology. And then eventually he became the dean of arts and sciences. And we don't remember exactly who was paired up to Nalin, but these three children were paired up with American students, and they had to follow the students wherever they went.
So was this something like that the administrators and teachers thought would work?
Well, I mean, they were going to give it a try.
Okay. Okay. Okay.
And of course, at home, this children had to learn to speak English, because my wife Jinx, she did not speak a word of Portuguese or a word of Gujarati.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
And it's amazing how the children can learn. And I read somewhere that if you speak more than one language, it's easier to pick up an additional language.
And so all of them already spoke two languages, even though.
Fluently. They
Yeah,
spoke
okay.
Portuguese fluently, and they spoke Gujarati fluently.
Okay.
And they had smatterings of French in school.
Okay.
The oldest daughter, who had 1 year of college, I went to University of Georgia and had her enroll as a freshman at UGA. And as I say, it helped because she spoke a little bit of English.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It helped the other children transacting with Jinx. And television was a big help.
Okay.
Okay. In the evenings, I would put them in front of the television, and one of the things I emphasized to them is to learn phrases.
Okay.
Okay. That's how I had really learned English in India. As I said, when I ended up in Bombay, all the classes were in English. So I depended on American movies. I saw a lot of American movies.
So how would you describe, how did they do in school? I mean, seems to me they had a lot of obstacles, a lot of struggles with language and everything.
Well,
Did they graduate?
oh yes, oh yeah, they did very well. To give you an example, sometime in April, one of my nieces, Madhu, was in a Chekhov play. She had no idea what she was saying,
But she was in the play.
but she could deliver a line in the play. And it's been many years, so it's hard for me to remember all the details. But having my sister, who spoke Gujarati and English, and her husband, and having the older niece who had some English, okay, and between that and the sign languages, okay, and me, of course, they learned to speak English. And then what we had to do is the boys had jobs throwing newspapers. The girls had jobs babysitting children. My older niece used to crochet, so they were making Christmas ornaments.
Were you surprised at how helpful the public schools were?
Oh, you have no idea. I often get emotional because Athens, the public school system in particular, and the Athens community at large, they were so helpful in making these children feel at home and understanding the difficulty that they would have in negotiating, whether it's cafeteria food, to using the library, to speaking English and all that. But miraculously, by the time the parents came, the children were sufficiently fluent in English, because when, end of June, in Mozambique, Frelimo was going to officially take over the government, and they had already announced that there'll be no private property. So my brother and my sister-in-law and my mother, who by that time we were successful in getting them what's called the green card, the immigrant visa, and they literally left home, went to the airport, and flew first to England to visit some friends in London, and then to Athens, to Atlanta.
How did the people of Athens who knew them or about them, how did they respond to them coming to Athens?
Again, as I said, the school system was incredibly helpful in accommodating these students. I also needed to get immigrant visas for my family. I also had to get businesses in Athens offer employment to my brother and to my sister-in-law. So my sister-in-law, by the way, as I say, my sister was already here.
Right.
Okay, in April of '74. And now we're talking about June, July of 1975, when my brother, my sister-in-law, and my mother arrived. Okay. So I should say, by the way, so at my house, we went from a family of 4 to a family of 8 to a family of 11, living in a house with, again, 3 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms. We had a big a family room that had been a carport and a garage. So that was a place where at night would become a dormitory. The boys would sleep in the playroom. The girls slept on the couch in the living room. We had 2 couches that turned into beds.
So this is a story, I've, had you tell me some of this before, that is an incredibly positive story about public school education, teachers, administrators, counselors.
Absolutely. I cannot emphasize that hard enough.
And also, it's such a positive story with a difficult beginning when you have to think about what these people were escaping, but it's a beautiful story to me about immigration.
Absolutely.
And thinking of the people in the community of Athens and at the university who assisted other family members.
That's right. So to tell about how my sister-in-law, for example, and my sister spoke English because they came from Zambia. My sister-in-law did not speak any English. So they found a job. Mr. Schindel, he had a factory on Oconee Street where they would sew children's clothes. And that's where my sister and my sister-in-law found their first employment.
Wonderful.
Okay, so my sister-in-law was putting together already pre-cut materials into children's clothes. My brother, we had to find him a job. And there was a store in Alps Road, shopping area, something like the Targets. And he had to learn, but my brother-in-law, again, he worked there. He had a job there as a floor person pointing people where to find what. So my brother got a job there. And of course, he spoke no English. But he managed to, again, they had to learn the hard way. And having my brother-in-law in the same shop was very helpful. So they got jobs doing those kind of things.
Wonderful.
And so that lasted, for a while. Now, I should also point out that just before they were leaving Mozambique, we happened to be at a party at Ann Hinton's house. And somebody asked me on a Saturday evening, what's happening with your family? And I said, well, as we speak, they are leaving Mozambique and going to London, and they'll be here in less than a week. And somebody asked me about housing. I said, well, we'll just have to see what happens. This was Saturday night. Sunday morning, we get a call from a real estate agent. Said, I understand you may be looking for a house for your brother and family. Would you be interested in a 3-bedroom fixer-upper and 5 points. And Jinx and I said, absolutely. So we jumped in the car and met up with this real estate agent and looked at this house. This house had just come on the market. The lady who lived there had died, but this house is no longer, it's been torn down. It was on Oakland, off not too far from Millage, on Oakland.
Mm-hmm.
And we saw it. It was a house that you enter in the door, there was a staircase going up, and then there were bedrooms and where this lady lived. And upstairs, there are 2 rooms with bathrooms, and she would rent those to students. We said, yes, we want to buy this house. So Monday, I called up Athens Bank and Trust, I think. I forget, it's changed the name, it's Stenovus now. But we had our house loan from this bank, so we knew Bucky Redwine, who was one of the officers at this. So I called him up. I said, Bucky, I need a loan, but I don't have any money for down payment. Remember, I had just been promoted to associate professor.
Right, right.
And we had been supporting 8 people in our family. And Bucky Redwine says, Doc, can you scare up $500? So I said, yes, I'll put together $500. And we bought this house for $15,000.
Wow.
And then we had manpower. We had my sister and brother-in-law, my 4 nieces and nephews, and then, of course, my brother and my sister-in-law came, and my mother, but they all lived with us. And during the summer of 1975, we cleaned up this house, painted it, did whatever had to be done for them to move into this house sometime in August or September of 1975.
Well, Gordon, this is a remarkable story. This is a remarkable story. I think so many people who know you, and many people do know you and Jinx. I should say for this interview that Jinx's real first name is Virginia.
Yes.
But we all know her and love her and call her Jinx. And I think her story would also just be so incredibly interesting because we have often told her, some of the women friends of hers, that we don't know if we could have done what she did to make these kids welcome, to have your assistance. I know, I mean, and this is a story for another time, but I know those children who are now adults themselves and have careers have done tremendously well with their lives, and I think that a bit of that can be attributed to the way they were treated and the experiences that they had in the Clark County Public Schools. So as a citizen of this area, I just want to say it makes me feel very proud to think about people in the community who reached out to you and assisted your family with adjustments, harsh adjustments that they had to make, and also the schools for the commitment and the direction that they gave these kids. So
yes, and so if I may to talk about what happened. So my family, I told them while they were here, I said, your focus, we'll find the money somehow. Your focus should be to learn to speak English, most important. Secondly, learn the American ways of life, and do whatever you can to contribute to the financial picture for the whole family. So everybody worked very hard. If they were not in school, they were doing something else to earn some money. So they were in Athens for 2 years, living in the house that we had bought for them and doing whatever they could. Now, I should point out that Jinx and I were always thinking, what are we going to do long term for my family? And many Indians who were coming from Africa in those days, when African countries were becoming independent, for example, in Uganda, when Idi Amin took over Uganda, the British left, he kicked out all Indians. And East Africa had had trade relations with India, for centuries.
A long time.
So many of these people had money stored in British banks. And coincidentally, in the United States, all these motels, which used to be, when I came here, they used to be the one-row rooms where you drove up to, you exchanged money for key. Those mama and papas were essentially going out of business because the Holiday Inns and Ramada Inns were also building motels or motel-type structures.
Right.
And so these Indians who had money were able to buy these motels, live there, and do all the work, cleaning, making the beds, cleaning the rooms and whatnot, because they had the manpower. And many of those people, their children are the ones who are now CEOs of big companies. But the parents sacrificed for the good of the future of the children. So my brother and his wife, they wanted to go into a motel business. And I and Jinx were determined that they are not going to go have that kind of a life, which is tough. So we were always thinking about what are we going to do I thought about opening up Indian restaurants in Athens. We already had identified places where they could have takeout food, but they were not interested in going in food business. We were even, my family used to send me mango pickles, very hot, and all Indians loved my family recipes. So I had already arranged for a supplier in Florida to provide us mangoes before they get, the seed hardens, and we will have manpower to mix up the spices and all that. But they worked for 2 years at these jobs. And then a parallel story was my sister-in-law's brothers. Her older brother had come to the United States to go to college, and he had a degree in engineering, and he had first job in Colorado Springs working for Ampex, one of the electric companies. And like all Indians, he decided now he was going to go into some kind of a retail business. Mm-hmm. So he was there. So parallel to my family story, his family from Mozambique, my sister-in-law's parents and brothers, they were in Colorado Springs. So my sister-in-law really wanted my brother and their family to move to Colorado Springs. it really tore me up because I had gotten used to my mother being here, and as you know, I mean, I spent very little time with my family. I left India when I was 14 years old, 5 years in boarding school and college there. Then I came to the United States, and I had not gone home for many years. So this was time for my mother to get to know Jinx and my children. But anyway, in the end run, my sister-in-law prevailed, and they decided to move to Colorado Springs. So the house that we had fixed up in Five Points, I transferred that house to my brother so that he could take the profit from the house that they would sell and use that to start his own business in Colorado Springs. So when they sold the house in 1977, fall, September, they made something like $12,000 or $15,000. They went to Colorado Springs, where they had, again, family support, my sister-in-law's brothers and parents. And they started a coffee shop in a big mall. And because there was already a restaurant that served hot food, they could only serve sandwiches and coffee and ice cream and things like that. But my brother's children, they went to school, but at the end of school, they would come and work in those shops. And they were very personable, very charming. So they met a lot of friends in the shopping mall, the people who worked there. So on a given day, if nobody came shopping, they still had clientele, people who worked there. So they started with that $15,000, $20,000 profit that they made. They started this coffee shop. And then, everybody had, to pitch in to do whatever they needed to do. Then they started picking up laundry shops. They had 9 stations where they picked up laundry throughout Colorado Springs. They had a big contract from the Air Force Academy, which was located in
Right
Colorado
there.
Springs. And again, the game was make as much money as you can, save as much money as you can. And then they started buying land, and they started building motels, not buying one-room, stretch motels, but they started building proper motels. Anyway, and again, discipline was, save money and expand the business. And I'm proud to say they're my 2 nephews right now who had come to Athens speaking no English. They own 5 major hotels, 3 at Denver Airport and 2 in Castle Rock, which is about 30 miles south of there. And all of them have big homes, and they are the American success stories. So not only have they contributed to the tax structure of the United States by working, but now they employ a lot of people. Okay. So I think they are a classic example of an immigrant family that has come to the United States and made significant contribution to the United States. So I'm very proud of them.
Great. Well, Gordhan, I'm sure they're very proud of you and delighted to be that they are your nephews and nieces. I want to thank you so much for doing this interview. I think, as I said at the beginning, I think a lot of people know about your stellar academic experience.
You're very kind.
I think, signed all my students' dissertations and their master's degrees. So a lot of people know you because of your academic prowess. But I think that this story that you've shared in this interview is a story of your life that many didn't know. And it is a story that has struggles and sadness, a revolution, but it also is a beautiful story of family. And I'm selfishly very glad that it took place in Athens, Georgia.
Yeah.
So thank you so much for talking with me today and doing this interview.
And I should really point out how important my wife Jinx has been in dealing with
Indeed.
my family. If Jinx and I were to get a divorce tomorrow,
You better not.
but if we were to get a divorce after 60 plus years of marriage, they would all side with Jinx. They would not side with me.
Well, I don't think that's going to happen. So
I know, but I had to give her the credit.
Absolutely.
Okay, and I've been
Absolutely.
fortunate to be at the university and have had an interesting career, both in science and in academic administration.
Yes.
So
Yes,
I'm
indeed.
grateful to Athens and Athens community and friends like you and others, that I have made over the years.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you so much for sharing all of this. I'm glad we have it recorded now so we can share it with other people. Thank you again.
You're welcome. Thank you.